I wanted to walk out. I wanted to turn around, get back in my truck, and drive the 4 hours home without looking back. But my son's hand found my arm in the crowd, and he leaned close and said quietly, steadily, the way he used to when he was 8 years old and trying not to cry, "Stay, Dad, please. I need you here. Trust me." So I stayed. My name is Gerald, and I am 63 years old. I have worked with my hands every single day of my adult life. I spent 31 years as a finished carpenter trim work, custom cabinetry, staircases, the kind of detail work that takes patience most people no longer have. I built houses for other people and, eventually, a modest one for myself on 2 acres outside of Orangeville, Ontario. Nothing fancy. A workshop in the back. A vegetable garden my wife Margaret kept until she couldn't anymore. Margaret passed 4 years ago. Colon cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end of everything I had known for 35 years. My son Daniel was 30 at the time, already living in Toronto, working in commercial real estate. My daughter Patricia was 27, a nurse in Hamilton. They both came home for the last weeks. We sat together in that living room and we held each other up, the 3 of us. And when it was over, we were hollowed out but still standing. I tell you this because you need to understand what Daniel meant to me when he called last spring and said, "Dad, I met someone. I think she might be it." Her name was Vanessa. Her full name was Vanessa Hargrove, and her father was a man named Clifford Hargrove, real estate developer, Yorkville condo projects, the kind of man whose handshake comes with a business card before you've finished saying hello. Daniel had met Vanessa at a fundraiser gala for a hospital foundation. She was 31, polished, well-spoken, beautiful in the way that takes significant maintenance. I am not saying that to be unkind. I am saying it because it is the detail that matters later. I met her for the first time at a dinner in Toronto, Daniel's apartment. He cooked. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he kept refilling water glasses that were already full. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, kissed him on the cheek without apology, and spent most of the dinner asking me careful questions. Not curious questions, careful ones. "So you're still in the trades, Gerald?" I said I was semi-retired but still took on projects. "And the property in Orangeville, is that where you've always been?" I said we'd bought it in 1994. Margaret had loved the space. 2 acres, Daniel mentioned. "That must be a lot to manage alone at your age." At my age, I was 62. I nodded and smiled and said I managed fine. After dinner, while Daniel was in the kitchen, she looked at me directly and said, "He speaks about you constantly, you know. I think he worries about you being out there by yourself." She paused. "We all want what's best for him." I drove home that night thinking about the way she had said we when she meant I. Over the following months, I watched my son change in small ways. He stopped mentioning Sunday calls because Vanessa preferred their weekends unscheduled. He canceled a planned fishing trip to Algonquin, the one we'd been doing every September since he was 15, because there was a wedding in Muskoka they had to attend. He apologized each time, briefly, and moved on. Patricia noticed before I said anything. She called me one evening in October and said, "Dad, something feels off." She never looks him in the eye when she talks to other people. I told her I didn't want to judge. Patricia said, "I know. Me neither. But I'm watching." The engagement was announced in November. They'd been together 8 months. Clifford Hargrove hosted an engagement dinner at a private room in a King Street restaurant, 60 guests, 4 courses, an open bar. I drove in from Orangeville in my work truck because my car was getting new brakes and I hadn't had time to sort it. I wore the sport coat I'd bought for Margaret's cousin's retirement dinner 2 years prior. Clean shirt, good shoes. I walked into that room and heard it before I fully registered who had said it. A voice, her voice bright and carrying, and pointed at the cluster of her friends near the bar. "Oh, the country dad is here." Daniel said he might not make it something about the drive. Laughter. Small, polite, and real. My throat closed. I stood in the doorway of a room full of strangers in expensive clothing, and I felt every one of my 62 years press down on my shoulders at once. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the drive. I thought about turning around. And then Daniel was there, hand on my arm, steering me gently away from the door, and he bent his head close and said, quiet enough that only I could hear, "Dad, I know exactly what I'm doing. Don't react. Not tonight." I looked at him. His face was calm. His eyes were calm. This was not the face of a man embarrassed by his father. This was something else entirely, and I did not understand it yet, but I trusted it. I said, "Okay." He squeezed my arm once and let go, and we walked into the room together. The dinner was long. Clifford Hargrove toasted his daughter with the easy warmth of a man who has given many toasts. He mentioned Daniel's impressive trajectory in commercial real estate. He mentioned Vanessa's exceptional taste and high standards. The room laughed as though this was charming rather than instructive. He did not mention me. At one point during the main course, he leaned across the table toward me and said, "Pleasantly, Daniel tells me you have a property out past Brampton somewhere?" "Orangeville," I said. Right. Beautiful country out that way." He cut into his beef tenderloin. "You thought about what you'll do with it? Seems like a lot to maintain. Market out there has softened, mind you, but there's still appetite for land parcels if you're looking to simplify." I said I hadn't thought about it. He smiled the way people smile when they've already thought about it for you. That night, driving home on the 400, I called Patricia. I told her what had happened, what Vanessa had said at the door, what Clifford had said at the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did Daniel say to you when he pulled you aside?" I told her. She said, "Dad, he knows." The engagement was 6 weeks long. The wedding was planned for late June, a venue in Prince Edward County, 140 guests, a budget I never asked about and didn't want to know. Daniel called me in early December and told me the plan. He had known about Vanessa's intentions since August. He had found a series of text messages not by snooping, but because she had handed him her phone to look something up and had forgotten to close a thread with her friend. In those messages, Vanessa had outlined, in practical and unsentimental terms, her interest in Daniel's future inheritance, my property in Orangeville specifically. She had mentioned the acreage, the location relative to expanding commuter development, the likelihood that a man living alone past retirement would be open to suggestions about simplifying his estate. She had referred to me, in those messages, as the old contractor. Daniel had screenshotted everything before handing the phone back. He had said nothing to Vanessa. He had called a lawyer the following week. What he had done over the 4 months between August and the engagement dinner was this. He had quietly, methodically, and completely protected everything. He had spoken with an estate lawyer in Toronto, a woman named Rosalind Park who specializes in family asset protection. Together they had reviewed my existing will, which was outdated and vulnerable in ways I hadn't realized. We updated it. We established a family trust with my 2 acres, and the house properly structured inside it, with Daniel and Patricia as co-trustees and specific legal language that made any spousal claim against the property essentially inert. We had also, at Rosalind's suggestion, updated my power of attorney documents, because Clifford Hargrove had been asking Daniel questions about those too. Daniel had also, calmly and without drama, documented every conversation in which Clifford had made comments about my property or my estate planning. He had kept a time-stamped notes file on his phone, 41 entries between September and December. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He said, "Because you would have confronted them, Dad, and then we'd have nothing." He was right. I would have. I'm not a man who absorbs that kind of thing quietly. I know this about myself. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday in late June, Prince Edward County, a barn venue east of Picton that Vanessa had booked 18 months prior. The morning was warm and clear. I drove down the night before and stayed at a motel in Belleville. Patricia drove up from Hamilton, and we had breakfast together at a diner on the main strip. She held my hand across the table and said, "Whatever happens today, we're okay. Everything is okay." I nodded. I believed her. The ceremony was beautiful, in the way that very expensive ceremonies are. White flowers everywhere, a string quartet, chairs arranged in perfect rows facing a window with a view of the lake. Vanessa walked down the aisle in a dress that must have cost more than my truck. She was radiant. I will give her that. And I sat in the front row on the groom's side, in a proper suit Daniel had helped me pick out in April. And I watched my son stand at the end of that aisle and look at the woman walking toward him. His face was completely still. The reception was where it happened. 2 hours in, after the first dances, after the toasts, including one from Clifford that lasted 11 minutes, and mentioned his daughter's discerning eye for quality 3 separate times, Daniel stood up from the head table and asked for a moment of everyone's attention. I thought he was going to say something sentimental, a toast to his bride. That's what everyone thought. He said, "I want to thank everyone for being here. This has been a meaningful day." He paused. "I also need to share something, because I believe honesty is the foundation of any real commitment." The room went still in that particular way that means everyone has stopped chewing. He said, calmly and without raising his voice, that he had become aware, early in their relationship, that certain conversations had taken place about his family's assets, specifically about his father's property, that he found troubling. He said he had documented those conversations. He said that he had, over the previous months, worked with legal counsel to ensure that his father's estate was fully and permanently protected. He said he was grateful for that process because it had made something very clear to him, clarity he felt everyone in the room deserved. He set an envelope on the table in front of Vanessa. He said, "I'm sorry. I should have done this differently, but I couldn't do it sooner and have it mean anything." Vanessa's face did not change immediately. It took about 4 seconds. I counted, and then something shifted behind her eyes, not anger, not yet something closer to recalibration. She looked at the envelope. She looked at her father. Clifford Hargrove had gone the particular color of a man whose blood pressure has just been notified of an emergency. The envelope contained a single document. I won't describe the legal language in detail, but the substance was this: an annulment filing prepared and signed prior to the ceremony, contingent on a notarization that Daniel had arranged to take place the following Monday. In Ontario, the window for certain legal actions following a ceremony is narrow, but it exists, and Rosalind Park knew exactly where it was. Daniel had technically married her, and he had technically already begun the process of undoing it, with documentation that predated the vows. 41 entries in a notes file, screenshotted texts, a family trust, a meticulous lawyer, and 4 months of saying nothing. I sat at that table, and I thought about my son at 8 years old, trying not to cry, and the steady, careful way he had always processed things before he acted. I thought about Margaret, who used to say that Daniel was the one who would surprise you. I thought about a man named Clifford Hargrove asking me what I planned to do with my property in a tone that assumed the answer. Vanessa left the venue within 20 minutes. Clifford followed her, phone already at his ear. Several of their guests filtered out with various degrees of discretion. Patricia reached across the table and found my hand. The people who stayed Daniel's friends, his colleagues, a handful of Vanessa's guests who seemed more bewildered than loyal stayed for another 2 hours. Daniel sat with me for most of it. We didn't talk about what had happened. We talked about the fishing trip we'd missed in September and whether we could still fit in a week in Algonquin before the weather turned. He said he'd already looked at dates. On the drive home the next morning, coming west on the 401 with the windows down and the radio off, I thought about what my son had done. Not the legal maneuver, not the documentation, not the envelope on the table, though all of that mattered. I thought about the moment in the doorway of the engagement dinner when he had appeared at my side, when I was already retreating inside myself, already cataloging every reason I didn't belong in that room. And instead of being embarrassed, instead of managing me quietly so I wouldn't cause a scene, he had leaned in close and said, "I know exactly what I'm doing. Trust me." He had been protecting me for months before I knew I needed protecting. He had sat across the dinner table from a man who was casually calculating the value of his father's land, and he had smiled and refilled the water glasses and said nothing, because he understood something I had not yet learned, that the right response to that kind of quiet predation is not confrontation. It is patience. It is documentation. It is walking into the room anyway. I got home around noon. I changed my clothes and went out to the workshop. I was building a harvest table, white oak, hand-cut mortise and tenon joints for a couple in Shelburne who'd been waiting since February. I stood at the bench and I ran my hand along the edge of a board and I felt the grain the way you do after 30 years of working wood, reading it through your fingertips before you make a single cut. My 2 acres were outside the window. The vegetable garden I'd been keeping up in Margaret's memory, the way the light came across the field in the afternoon, the particular quiet of that place that no one who had not lived inside it could fully understand. It was not impressive land. It was not strategically located or particularly valuable in the way that Clifford Hargrove understood value. But it was ours. It was the place my children had grown up. It was where we'd buried Margaret's ashes under the maple at the back corner of the property, where she'd asked. It would stay that way. The trust made sure of it. Before and after you subscribe, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it there? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever stayed quiet when every instinct told you to react, if you've ever bitten down on something and waited, because you knew that patience was the only tool that would actually work, then you know exactly what my son did in those 4 months. You know the cost of it. You know why it mattered. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice in an expensive restaurant or make a speech at a dinner it wasn't properly welcomed to. It shows up in a suit it needed help picking out. It sits at the table. It listens to everything. and it takes careful notes. My son learned that from somewhere. I'd like to think some of it was from me, but honestly, looking at how he handled all of it, I think he might have been teaching it back. The harvest table took me 3 more weeks to finish. White oak, like I said, solid enough to last 100 years. The couple in Shelburne cried when I delivered it, which still surprises me every time, even after 3 decades. They asked me how I knew it would hold together that long. I told them it's all in how you cut the joints. You have to be patient. You have to take your time and do it right the first time, because the shortcuts always show up eventually in the wood, in the work, and in the people who don't think you're paying attention. That's the story. That's the lesson. If it stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to fr-sweetrevenge. There are more stories coming, stories about families, about patience, about what it means to protect the people and the things that matter. I'll see you in the next one.